The real reason Napoleon lost everything. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as a military genius who conquered most of Europe, a man undone by a brutal Russian winter or a single disastrous battle at Waterloo. But those explanations are comfortable myths. They simplify a far more unsettling truth. Napoleon did not lose everything because of bad luck, weather, or even stronger enemies. He lost everything because the very qualities that built his empire, his ambition, certainty, and need for control, slowly became the forces that destroyed it. His downfall was not sudden, it was gradual, predictable, and largely self-inflicted. At the beginning of his rise, Napoleon's strengths were perfectly suited to his moment in history. Revolutionary France was chaotic, divided, and desperate for order. Napoleon offered clarity. He moved faster than his rivals, thought more decisively, and took risks others feared. He trusted his instincts when committees hesitated. This decisiveness made him unstoppable in Italy, in Egypt, and eventually in France itself. Each victory reinforced a dangerous lesson, that his judgment was superior to everyone else's, and for a time he was right. As first consul and later emperor, Napoleon didn't just rule France. He reformed laws, centralized administration, stabilized finances, and rewarded merit over aristocratic birth. Europe watched in awe as one man reshaped an entire nation and then bent empires to his will. Kings fell, borders were redrawn, armies that had dominated for centuries collapsed in weeks. Napoleon began to see himself not just as a ruler, but as an indispensable force of history. And this belief marked the beginning of the end. The problem was not that Napoleon sought power. It was that he could no longer imagine limits. Every success convinced him that expansion was necessary, even inevitable. Peace became a temporary pause, not a goal. Treaties were tools to be discarded when inconvenient. Allies were useful only until they hesitated. Napoleon's empire was built on constant motion, and stopping, even briefly, felt like weakness. In this way, his empire was never stable. It was always overextended, always demanding more conquest to justify its own existence. One of Napoleon's greatest mistakes was his inability to trust others. He centralized decision-making to an extreme degree. Generals who once acted independently were reduced to waiting for instructions. Ministers feared contradicting him. Advisors learned to tell him what he wanted to hear. This created an echo chamber at the highest level of power. Napoleon still believed he was surrounded by brilliance, but in reality, he was increasingly alone, cut off from honest feedback at the exact moment he needed it most. This isolation became fatal during the Continental System, Napoleon's attempt to economically suffocate Britain by blocking European trade. On paper, it was bold and strategic. In reality, it was unenforceable. Smuggling flourished, allies resented French control, and economies across Europe suffered, including France's. Instead of adjusting the policy, Napoleon doubled down. When nations resisted, he responded not with compromise, but with invasion. What began as economic pressure turned into endless military occupation, breeding resentment everywhere French troops marched. Spain was the first clear warning. Napoleon underestimated Spanish resistance, assuming a quick campaign would secure control. Instead, he triggered a brutal guerrilla war that drained French manpower and morale for years. It was a conflict that offered little glory and no decisive victory. Worse, it taught Europe that Napoleon could be resisted. The myth of his invincibility cracked, and once that illusion faded, coalitions against him became bolder and more determined. Yet Napoleon's most catastrophic decision was not in Spain. It was in Russia. The 1812 invasion was not forced by necessity. It was driven by pride and the refusal to accept disobedience. Tsar Alexander's withdrawal from the Continental System was an insult Napoleon could not tolerate. Rather than negotiate or adapt, Napoleon chose escalation on an unprecedented scale. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen and marched east, convinced that one decisive campaign would settle everything. What followed was not simply a military failure, but a psychological one. Napoleon believed that sheer will and numbers could bend reality itself. He ignored logistics, distance, and the possibility of retreat. When the Russian army refused to fight on his terms and retreated instead, Napoleon pressed forward, deeper into hostile territory, chasing a victory that no longer existed. By the time Moscow was reached, it was already too late. The campaign had become a trap built from his own assumptions. The retreat from Russia destroyed more than an army. It destroyed Napoleon's aura. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were lost, not just to combat, but to hunger, exhaustion, and exposure. Europe saw that Napoleon could be beaten, not by brilliance, but by endurance. His enemies regrouped, former allies defected, coalitions re-formed with renewed confidence, and Napoleon, for the first time, was reacting rather than shaping events. Even then, defeat was not inevitable. Napoleon still had opportunities to consolidate, negotiate, and preserve his rule, but he could not abandon the belief that one more victory would restore everything. In 1814, surrounded by enemies and exhausted resources, he continued fighting instead of securing peace. His abdication came only when resistance was no longer possible. Exiled to Elba, he was given a chance at quiet survival, something he had never learned to accept. His return during the 100 Days proved the final lesson. Napoleon still believed that destiny favored him, that soldiers would rally and enemies would falter. For a brief moment, it seemed possible, but Europe had changed. His opponents were cautious, coordinated, and determined not to repeat past mistakes. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced not just an army, but the accumulated consequences of years of overreach. The defeat was decisive because the system he built had no resilience left. In the end, Napoleon did not lose everything because he was defeated in battle. He lost everything because he mistook dominance for permanence and control for wisdom. He believed history moved forward through force alone, forgetting that power requires restraint to endure. His empire collapsed not under foreign pressure, but under the weight of his own certainty. Napoleon's story endures not merely as a tale of battles won or political power seized, but as a profound lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition and success. Time and again, his victories silenced doubt, convincing him that his judgment was infallible and that history itself bowed to his will. Authority replaced reflection, and the natural caution that guides even the wisest leaders was drowned out by pride. Ambition outran judgment, and in that relentless pursuit, even the greatest minds can become prisoners of their own legend. Napoleon may have conquered Europe, redrawn borders, and reshaped nations, but he could not conquer the inherent limits of power, foresight, and human endurance. That, far more than any army or winter, explains why he ultimately lost everything.